Hello and welcome to Security in Context. I am Anita Fuentes, and today I have the pleasure to talk to Eviane Leidig, a postdoctoral fellow at Tilburg University specialized in studying the far right. And we will be discussing her book, The Women of the Far Right: Social Media Influencers and Online Radicalization, which just came out this month. Welcome, Eviane. It's a pleasure to have you here.
Thanks for having me.
So, to begin, I would like to ask you, why did you decide to write this book, and what are the main issues that you cover in it?
So, I started writing this book sort of on accident. I was focused on another very different type of project, although I had been studying the far right for several years at this point. I started writing this book because I was noticing how much there would be this stereotypical image about what the far right looks like, particularly when it comes to media coverage or even within the scholarly community. So when we imagine, if we ask a random person, what do you imagine the far right to look like? I think there tends to be this general response of young, angry men, and predominantly young, angry white men in Western societies. And I knew based upon my research within this far right space that women did occupy oftentimes quite a prominent role within the movement, but it just wasn't nearly as visible when it came to coverage as well as recognition and understanding about what the far right looks like. So I started off this book looking at a number of female alt right YouTubers. So I will say I started writing this book during the so called alt right years of under Trump's presidency. And I was quite interested in not only like how they would be similar to their male counterparts in terms of offering that type of political commentary on YouTube or reacting to current events. They did the same thing as their male counterparts, but also how they were using other platforms like Instagram or other primarily YouTube and Instagram is where I focused on, and how they would also be discussing issues like dating or finding female friendship, and the way that these women would position themselves as a more of a holistic personal brand, which was a pretty stark contrast to their male counterparts within the movement. So that sort of led me to dive into this space, and I just became really interested in understanding how they were promoting their messaging, how they were selling far right ideology, and as what I argue in the book, how they're able to effectively leverage these mainstream social media platforms in order to essentially legitimize or normalize far right ideology for mainstream audiences.
You've kind of mentioned, I think you've kind of sort of answered the next question that I wanted to ask you, but I would like to, if you could, go a little bit more in depth about why it's important to study the role of women in far right movements. And also, I'm very curious about why you decided to focus specifically on social media influencers.
So indeed, like I think, as I mentioned earlier, it was about debunking stereotypes that we have as a society about who is involved in the far right and what sort of roles they play within that space. But I think when we talk about, in particular, women's political activism, it tends to focus on left-wing or progressive movements, and rightfully so, right? If we look at the history of like women's rights movements or feminist movements, and the suffragists before that, there's very valid and a strong history of women's mobilization within left-wing political spaces. But there is also a really long history of conservative women's activism that doesn't get talked about as much. And so this can, I mean, for an example, you can think about following the Reconstruction period during the Civil War in the US, where women were at the helm of the Confederacy in terms of trying to resurrect monuments after the war or trying to promote educational materials in order to, quote, preserve Southern heritage and culture. And even that happened after the Civil Rights Movement in the 1960s. So there's certainly a really long history of conservative women's political activism. And what I look at in my book, it's perhaps a bit more fringe than that. But my argument is that it is drawing upon these much broader spaces of mobilization. Um, Now, why did I want to study these women within the far right in the contemporary way? I think the last book about women in the far right in North America, at least, was written by Kathleen Blee 20 years ago. And there hasn't really been a contemporary or say modern day study looking at women in the far right today. An exception might be Saber Darby's book on Sisters in Hate, which is really, really great. But in terms of an academic text, there hasn't been actually that much up to date literature on that. So that was also part of the reason why I wanted to contribute to that field in terms of showcasing women in the far right and contemporary far right movements. And then specifically on social media influencers, that's such an interesting question because I think we tend to focus upon women's activism in a more formalized setting. You know, sometimes it could be their role as political party leaders or at the helm of various social movements. But I was really interested in the more cultural aspects of the far right, and in particular, but I will say, actually, I didn't first frame these women through their role as influencers. I first looked at them as activists, as political activists. But then I started to note how they were drawing upon aspects of influencer culture. So, like certain practices and genres, like micro celebrity practices, which is this idea about being like a celebrity within a very niche audience online, how they were using tactics like seeming quite relatable and accessible and authentic to their audiences. And so this sort of led me to situate my research through this frame in terms of understanding like how these women were presenting themselves. So I argue that they're both selling far right ideology as well as merging that with their personal brands and lifestyles in order to sort of what they see as sort of modeling what a far right family or society could look like.
Yeah, I definitely think it's very interesting to study influencer culture now because everything is so I guess influenced by that influencer culture. I mean, even I would say politicians like Marjorie Taylor Greene is very much using those tactics as well. So I think they are really influencing how even politicians or other activists are like doing their work, their political work now. Um, in order to write this book, you conducted a digital ethnography where you observed and you analyzed the content published by a number of far right women influencers. I wanted to ask you what motivated you to use this methodology and what are some of the challenges that you encountered throughout the research process? And I mean also ethical challenges and dilemmas that you encountered.
Yeah, so I have been doing ethnographic as well as digital ethnographic work for some time now, so that felt like a very natural approach for me to take when I started writing this book. And as I write about in the book, it's a very immersive experience. So I think there's some people who would say, well, you just analyze what they posted online, like what can we really gather or understand from that process? And I argue, and as I write in the book, like it was a very consuming daily task for me because I was constantly watching their Instagram posts or YouTube videos for several hours a day. I would get notifications on my phone constantly about their latest Instagram story, which I knew I had to view within 24 hours or that it would disappear. And like that type of ephemeral content can be quite difficult to track, especially as a qualitative researcher, because you really have to immerse yourself into that space. So I also write in the book about what it's like to be a follower and a subscriber of these women and to just also sort of document my own experience in being a user and a consumer of their content. So I did not interview these women or approach them for an interview due to a number of reasons that also relate to ethical issues. One being that it would be a risk to myself and perhaps to my colleagues if I did contact them because they could try to expose me or dox me to their audiences. So I was worried about the safety risks of that. But also, I felt, and this was justified in the research, that I didn't necessarily need to interview these women because they were really adept at showcasing their personal lives on display to a public audience. And of course, I understand that is a performance, but they were very open about discussing their personal backgrounds, who they were, who they came from, what led them to their political beliefs. And so if I did interview them, I would feel like there would be very little anything new that I could generate from those types of responses that they wouldn't already purposefully showcase to their followers. And so the focus of the book is, yes, on these women, but also very importantly, the the ways in which they frame their content, and how that gets consumed by audiences. And so in the book, I write that this is a story about the far right, but it's also a story about social media, and it's sort of how those two work in tandem, by these women to sell their ideology and the messaging.
Well, that's a very interesting. It's fascinating to me that also that you decided to use a digital ethnography precisely because of what you're saying. That it's really emotionally draining. I
Yeah.
would say, kind of work. So, I mean, congratulations, you did a great job.
Thanks. I mean,
Um,
I will say, like, I did create like a fake profile so that I could follow their accounts. I didn't want to use my own personal profile, for instance. I wanted to also create those boundaries in my work as well, as best as I could, right? Which was hard because I would get notifications in the evenings or on the weekends or when I was away for vacation. But how important it was to really try to maintain those boundaries. And I think, like, especially when you're doing research like this, it can become quite personal to you as a researcher as well. So I also write in the book about how there was many times when I felt like I could relate to these women because, we had grown up in similar environments. I felt like these are women that I could have gone to school with, growing up. Or they were also going through different life stages, like getting married and starting families, these sorts of life stages that I felt like I could relate to as well. So um, it's again, I think keeping those boundaries was actually something so important that I had to remind myself over and over again to maintain that critical distance necessary to analyze them.
So the influencers that appear in the book are mainly based in North America and to a lesser degree in Europe. However, as you point out in the book, the far right is becoming not only more mainstream but also more global. So, what role do these women influencers play in solidifying the far right's global connection? And this is a double question. What can you tell us about far right women influencers based outside of Western countries?
So I'm going to try to unpack this, the various steps. And I'm really glad you asked that question because there's one chapter in the book that is solely devoted to the global and transnational connections that these influencers have around the world. And indeed, most of them are based in North America, in the US and Canada. Some are North American that have lived in Australia, for example, or within Europe, but through those countries, they've been able to establish connections with other far right movements, such as the identitarian movement within Europe, for example. So, the way that I see it in terms of the scope and scale of those global connections or transnational connections, I guess it kind of depends on your interpretation of each of those. Is they demonstrate this at different layers. So on the one hand, there's the discursive aspect, which is sharing ideas and furthering far right ideology, showcasing connections. So oftentimes it could be through having formal interviews that they host on their YouTube channels with other prominent far right leaders, some women, some men, across Europe, and North America. And these are more like what we might see as like a type of media interview format. It's quite professionalized in that way. But sometimes it's just the more informal chats that they have with each other on their YouTube channels through different collabs. And it could be discussing aspects related to their political activism and career ambitions, but sometimes it is things like finding female friends within this space. And I think having that type of balance of content is quite vital because it showcases that, yes, you can focus on the politics, but you can also focus on the more social and cultural aspects. And they really try to showcase the far right in this very holistic way, in discussing both the politics and the cultural side of things. But then on Instagram, it's things like sharing selfies with each other, whether that's at rallies or at protests, sometimes sort of behind the scenes, when they're just hanging out after, say, a demonstration. And that side of it also is a type of propaganda message, because oftentimes they are showcasing to their viewers or their followers, if you join us, you will find this transnational sisterhood within the far right. We have this really strong built community here that is global in scope. So I would say that there are a number of different layers in which these types of global interactions or connections do happen. And, sometimes it's based upon current events, like sort of an offline protest. Other times it's just an online chat. It and sometimes I would say it's also about, giving speeches at, say, political conferences and rallies. So these are more institutionalized mechanisms in which they are quite visible within their activism. But yeah, it's all in one chapter of the books. But I encourage folks to take a look at that to just get a sense about how widespread this movement can be. And then your other question about like influencers based outside of Western countries,
Mhm.
and I would say this is a rather understudied phenomenon. So I myself have written about Indian women far right influencers, and along with a colleague, we also wrote an article comparing Indian influencers of Brazilian women far right influencers, and what are the similarities there when it comes to looking at two very highly visible far right movements in the global south. And we, of course, see that there's some similarities with the women influencers in North America and Europe. But there's other certain aspects that we picked up on, which is oftentimes how privileged these far right influencers can be in non-Western countries in promoting far right agendas and platforms. How very often they reproduce a lot of the social hierarchies based upon their privilege, whether that's economic or racial or gendered hierarchies. But in general, it is a rather understudied phenomenon. So I would say that it's still a developing field when it comes to looking at influencers outside of North America and Europe.
So the last chapter of the book offers a variety of ways to challenge the hateful narratives and ideas that they're being that they are spreading, these influencers are spreading on the internet. So in this chapter, you distinguish between hard and soft approaches. Could you give us a brief overview of these approaches and maybe tell us which ones you think are the most effective in countering this phenomenon, countering the far right?
So, indeed, the last chapter is various ways of countering and challenging the far right. And I focus on both online and offline approaches. But when it comes to the online approaches, indeed, I distinguish these as the hard and the soft approaches. And we can maybe think about the first hard as being more of the repressive measures. And with this, I discuss various strategies of content moderation tools, which is a set of technical practices that platforms can use to stymie or to challenge the far right content on their platforms. And so I call this the 4 Ds of content moderation. So the first D is deplatforming, and that's probably what most of us think about when it comes to countering the far right online, which is banning an account or a user from that platform, usually permanently. Although there's also suspension, which is a temporary form of deplatforming, usually for a period of that can range from a day to several months. Um, but there's other tools within content moderation that are perhaps less well known. So the second D is what I call demonetization, and this is mostly used within the discussion about platforms that allow creators to monetize. And so YouTube is a really good example of that, as well as Instagram, although I think it hasn't been so prevalent within our public discussion about monetization and demonetization strategies. And that is simply like restricting an influencer from being able to make being able to restrict an influencer of from income generation on the platforms. So whether that be like direct crowdsourced donations or Sometimes it's sponsors, or in the case of YouTube, predominantly advertising revenue. So it's really restricting their ability to generate income on these platforms. The third D is deranking. And that's more about manipulating algorithmic recommendations so that, say, the visibility of these influencers' content doesn't pop up, say, on like the top search results, for example, or may not even come up in the search results. And so this has been, I think, a more in my opinion, a tool that could perhaps be more widely used because it doesn't necessarily ban them from a platform, but it just restricts their visibility in terms of the potential audience reach of their content. And then the fourth D of content moderation is that of detection. And this is the most difficult one because essentially it is trying to use a combination of both technical as well as human tools that platforms can levy in order to determine what could be violative content on the platform. But I will say that influencers are very good at circumventing the regulation of their content, and they'll do so through things like coded language or textual and visual manipulation. I saw this a lot during the pandemic when they were sharing a lot of COVID disinformation. So deliberately misspelling the word vaccination, for example, by using different characters like the @ or using the letter V followed by an axe emoji, right? So these are sort of various tactics that they employ in order to avoid having their content get flagged for moderation by the platform. But these four Ds, I think, are really at the crux of what we could consider various hard approaches or repressive measures when it comes to regulating these influencers' content and overall as strategies to help counter the far right's growing presence online. Now, when it comes to soft approaches, so these are approaches that some listeners might be familiar with, which is one predominant one is that of counter narratives. So for those of you who are unfamiliar, like counter narratives, they involve government, private sector, and civil society organizations that work together to create and oversee programs that will help promote positive narratives through things like campaigns in order to challenge extremist propaganda. And sometimes these campaigns might be about directing users towards de-radicalization content or helping to debunk myths or talking points that the far right uses for its recruitment and radicalization. I will say when it comes to counter narratives, the evidence about effectiveness can be a bit shaky, in part because we just don't have that much data about, who actually clicks on these links, or like, are users already radicalized and then that motivates them towards this de-radicalizing content, or is it more effective when it comes to a broader, more general audience? And so I do sort of caution against solely using counter narratives because indeed there's a lot of money that's being funneled into this industry, but in terms of the effectiveness, that's still in question and something that's developing. But on the other hand, I do think there is a strong case, at least when I'm studying this influencer space, to think about an additional soft approach, which is that of counter influencers. So these are usually content creators that we see on platforms that like TikTok or Instagram, who basically create content that will help to debunk a lot of far right myths and narratives. And think about these as individuals who just might be really motivated or might have backgrounds where they want to educate the population about the harms of far right ideology. And there's been some preliminary studies, very, very preliminary studies, looking at the effectiveness of counter influencers. And what the research tells us is that if we do rely upon counter influencers, one thing to bear in mind is what is their motivation for creating this content? What is perhaps their own personal ideology in doing so? Like, do they come from an anti-fascist background, for example? And so that is their primary motivation. What are the various strategies that they employ for audience engagement? And oftentimes they are the ones who know best what audiences want, which is what could make them really effective. And then what are the potential risks if, say, governments want to work with these counter influencers in broader campaigns or as part of broader counter extremism strategies? Sometimes there could be public distrust if a government partners up with an influencer, right? Because they'll think it's kind of cliche or that it's kind of cheesy, and then they might say, well, the government's now employing these influencers. Can I really trust them? And can they be authoritative in what they say? So, sort of in response to that, it's really vital for these counter influencers to maintain their credibility for their audiences and allow them that independence and control over the creativity process, right? Because once governments start, dictating what they should or shouldn't say, that creates immediate red flags and distrust amongst perhaps communities that they're trying to reach within their audience. So that's just an overview, I would say, in terms of what are the hard and the soft approaches when it comes to countering the far right online.
Great. Is there anything you'd like to add that I haven't covered in my questions? I know I have asked you a lot of questions. I try to cover a lot, but if there's anything you'd like to add to end, perhaps tell us about where we can purchase your book.
Yes, of course. Yes, so you can purchase the book, The Woman of the Far Right. You can purchase it from the publisher's website, but you can also find it on Amazon and Google Books, as well as a number of booksellers. I think you can get it also at Barnes and Noble in the US, at Target and Walmart. So it is widely accessible. But I really highly encourage folks to take a look at it. And I've tried to write the book also from a very personal reflection. So it is intended to be really accessible and for a general reader. So it doesn't have tons of academic language in there, but it's really about presenting these women through their stories and through a very character driven narrative. So I hope that you
I've
enjoy
read
reading
it.
it.
I can tell all of our listeners and the people who are watching that Evian is not lying. It is very accessible, very easy, a very easy read, but also a very intelligent, I would say, reflection about the far right today, and specifically the role of women and the significance of gender also in understanding the far right. So I definitely recommend that everybody reads this book. It is available on the Columbia University Press website. You can read more about it and learn more about it. And yeah, thank you so much, Eviane, for joining me today.
Thanks so much for having me. It was a great conversation.